This is Dust, Documents and Diamonds, a podcast about history, researching history, and the joy of finding diamonds when we search the archives for the dust of past lives.
So, we know that people have always listened to music and played music, and we're often told that the kind of music people play and listen to tells us a lot about the way society is and how fast it's going to hell in a handbasket. But of course, the thing is that in ages past, we don't have a lot of piles of CDs and so on. So how do we know what kind of music people played and listened to in the past? And if we do know, what can it tell us about their lives and their society? Now, of course, in the 15th century, something very important happened in Europe, which was, of course, the introduction of printing. And we know the kind of revolution this caused in learning, in the spread of news, in the spread of ideas, and all of those things. But it was also important for music, which began to be printed around 1500. So what does the printing revolution mean for music? And what does it mean for the story of printing if we include music in that story? And so here to talk about all that is Dr Katie McKeogh of King's College London, who's working on a big research project on the dissemination, the ownership and the reading of music in early modern Europe, which is roughly 1500 to 1545 for the purposes of this project. And that is the years, the first decades of the printing of music. So thanks, Katie. So what can you tell us about the work you're doing for a start?
Thank you, Lucy. So I'm part of a 3-woman team led by Elizabeth Kieselbrecht and our colleague Louisa Hunter-Bradley. And Louisa and Elizabeth are music historians with a book historian bent. And I'm on board as I like to call myself the interloping historian, but I am musical as well. And I suppose we can come back to talking about whether that's necessary to do this kind of work. So, as you said, music, polyphonic music starts getting printed in around the year 1500, 1501 with a landmark publication by Ottaviano Petrucci, who prints something that's known as the Ode Hecaton, which is a collection of the sort of best Franco-Flemish music of the age by people like Josquin. By polyphonic music.
Just to recap, so the first music is printed in 1491, and that's we would recognize with little notes on a stave. And what kind of music is this that they're printing?
So in terms of what we would recognise as music, little notes, little dots on lines with sometimes tails and sometimes not tails. You do get that a bit earlier than the period that I'm talking about. So you get that coming in the 1470s for printed a kind of music called plain chant. So these are generally just little squares or little sort of diamond-shaped squares that are designed for communicating the liturgy, and that appears, as I said, from around the 1470s, and they're printing this with movable type. What's important about the Ode Hecaton in around 1500, 1501, printed by Petrucci, is that this uses a new technique that Petrucci perfects called the triple impression mode of printing. What this means is that the sheet of paper will actually go through the printing press 3 times. So it's pretty labor intensive as a way of printing. But if you imagine a piece of music printed on paper, it doesn't matter what sort of genre or period that piece of music is from. There's actually quite a lot going on. You've often got words, you've got the lines, the staves or staff lines that the music has to sit on in order for it to have meaning. We need to know what pitch to sing or play, and that is shaped by where the little dots or diamonds appear on these horizontal stave lines. So with Petrucci, you have this 3-stage process where first the staves are printed that the notes are going to sit on. These are these horizontal lines. Then the text, and then the notes.
Oh, okay.
And eventually this gets refined. So throughout the period that we're looking at on the project, you get down to single impression, which is where you can do all these things on one run through the printing press. So it makes the process of compositing the type actually quite complicated, because you have sort of lines and things on the lines and words going on all at once. And if those little diamonds or squares aren't in precisely the right place, you change the music. And that sort of disrupts things. But of course, there are printing errors as there are printing text.
So what does it do to music when this technique becomes available and you can print whole sort of pages of musical notation?
Yeah. Well, of course, one of the marketing claims that printers and publishers in this period like to make is that something, newly imprinted will be error-free. And of course, we know that that's not the case, but it is a considerably more reliable way of producing a large number of versions of the same text, or in this case, the same combination of sigla and text.
Musical text.
Yeah, the other thing that happens is that suddenly, as happens with the printing press more generally, the consumers of these objects, these printed objects, suddenly have access to a much wider range, and it's a question of supply and demand. So because you suddenly have a lot more printed objects available, the overall cost goes down. So suddenly people can access printed music in a way that they couldn't necessarily before, unless you were able to afford to pay a scribe or a copyist to produce a sort of beautiful personalized manuscript for you.
And so would this change the kind of music that people were hearing and playing if suddenly they have more access perhaps to music that's been written a long way away by someone who would never be in their community, or does that change the kind of music that people are actually playing?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a really interesting and really important question that is one of the sort of lodestars for the project, really, is thinking about music as an agent of cultural transfer. And this is something that Elizabeth has worked on already. When you have a market for something and you are aiming to sell as much as that as possible, you have to have some sort of insight as to what people want to buy. And of course, that changes throughout the period that we're talking about. I mean, it's not like sort of nothing happens culturally in the first half of the 16th century. So you have sacred music being printed, for example, and that's a really useful lens for assessing cultural change, because, of course, religious change is just a minor theme for these first 45 years of the 16th century. So the kinds of music that you need to print post-Reformation and during the Reformation is very different, because the liturgy has changed so much. And because on sort of both sides of the confessional pendulum, if you like, people are arguing about the role of music in worship, and that what the role of polyphonic music in worship. And maybe I should say briefly what I mean by polyphonic music, this word that keeps coming up. Yeah, so what that means is, instead of plain chant where you have one line of music, With polyphonic music, the word poly is in there, right? So you've got multiple lines of music happening at the same time, and they might weave in and out of each other. If you've heard any sort of 16th century music, you might be familiar with these kinds of meandering lines of text that move in and out of each other. But it can also be something that looks maybe like a modern hymn book. If you pick up the thicker, heavier hymn book from the table when you walk into church, that's got harmony as well as the tune, right? You'll have sort of 4 lines of music, and I suppose we do at the musical level differentiate slightly between that kind of polyphony, where you have blocks of chords moving generally at the same time, and polyphony can be quite complex in the way that lines of music move in and out. But to keep it simple, what we're interested in are multiple pitches happening at the same time, so multiple lines of music,
So
as
different
opposed to
singers,
plain chant.
different
Yeah.
singers singing different notes.
Exactly, or instruments playing different notes.
Yeah. Okay.
So one of the ways that around this time the printing press is changing music and changing what kinds of music people have access to is informed by religion and the needs of one of the most important customers for printers of music and books containing music, which are the various churches across Europe, who are, useful clients, who will commission and buy in large numbers all kinds of different books containing music for worship.
Yeah.
But you also have, of course, the dissemination of music, music being printed perhaps in Rome or Paris or in the Low Countries, coming over to England, and even perhaps beyond Europe, where when people move, they take things with them, particularly things that they can sell. And so music books traveling with other kinds of books, music books being sold at the book fairs like Frankfurt. And as people have their eyes, or I suppose ears, open to different kinds of music, they suddenly want more of it. They want different things. And the publishers and printers respond to that by giving people what they want, so that they can be economically viable or even economically successful.
So the project you're looking at is you are looking at as many of these printed books as you can find, essentially.
Yeah, right. So between 1500 and 1545, there are about 440 editions of polyphonic music, and that polyphonic music comes in various different kinds of book, really quite wide-ranging. Of those 440 editions, we have just over 1,800 copies surviving across Europe and in some libraries in North America as well.
So your project is trying to work out what actually happened to all of these physical printed books after they got printed and before they finished up in the libraries that they're in now.
Exactly. Everything that happened to those individual copies, where they went, to whom they went, and what those users, consumers of printed music books did with those books. All of those things we're trying to sort of capture and explore.
Because of course the fact is that a 16th century book of music now, it might be in some research library or some archive, but it didn't go straight there. So a lot has happened between
absolutely
some printer printing this book in order to sell it and and make some money, and it ending up in a research library to be pored over by the likes of you and me.
Yeah.
And so your idea is to find out the story of that book, where it's been.
Absolutely. And we're early modernists, so we're mostly interested in what happened to it in the 150 to 200 years after it was printed. But what we want to do is to, in creating a sort of knowledge base, a database, which is an important kind of output of the project, we want to enable all kinds of scholars, music historians, and any other scholar you can think of to have the sort of bibliographic foundations they need to be able to conduct research. So if you're interested in the acquisition policies of the British Library as regards music in the 19th century, or the British Museum as was then, you can use our database, and you can find out perhaps where these books might have been before the British Library got its hands on them.
Yeah. So if you're in the archives and you're, looking for traces of music practice and people using music, what are you looking for?
Yes, so again, a really good question. We're lucky in that we don't just sort of have to go blindly in with our magnifying glasses and a sort of wish list. So we start off by looking at a big database of printed and actually some manuscript music called RISM. And this is a resource that was completely unknown to me before I joined the project, but is something that anyone who's studied music, and particularly music history, will know really well. For historians, it's basically like the short title catalogue, but of music. And what that does is it reports the holdings of libraries back to people interested in music, be that through composers or printers or particular pieces of music. So it'll say, this is the edition, and here are the copies of that edition, and here are the ones that survive, and this is where they are. So we have, with the help of our magical digital humanities partner, with RISM, we've been able to export all of that information into a database, and we have been able to construct, therefore, a series of research trips based around which repositories have the largest number of books, and where we can go.
A repository meaning a library.
Meaning a lot, yeah, exactly. And that might be a national collection like the British Library or the Bibliothèque Nationale in France, or it might be a university library, or it might be the library of a conservatoire. That is to say, a specialist educational institution for the highest level performance of music.
Yeah. Okay. So you've got this database. You can look for all the different books in the different libraries. You know roughly where you'll find them, and you can head for the library, the library that has the books. And so when you get there, what are we looking at in these books?
So I suppose the most common book that we encounter is a part book. And what that means is, if you imagine a piece of music for 4 voices, or perhaps 4 instruments, each of those parts is printed separately. So we're used to seeing things all printed together on a page on top of each other. Mm-hmm. But if you are accustomed to playing in orchestras, perhaps you would be you'd be used to having just the first violin part or the second cello part, because of course orchestral music has so many different parts going on. But in this period, even for say 3 or 4 part or voice music, these parts are going to be printed separately, and they are most likely, because this enables their performance, they are most likely then to be bound separately. So with one publication, you might get 4 bound volumes. Now, the reason that's important is because it means that you and your 3 singing or playing friends can each, sitting in your closet or your parlor room, you can sit round and you can play or sing your individual part. The flip side to that, the other major layout for printed music is called a choir book, and as a religious historian, Lucy, that's the kind that you might be familiar with. So you might have seen woodcuts of boys and men and priests singing from a big lectern in the nave of a cathedral or a big church, and a really, really tall, quite broad book. And there will be, say, 4 different parts printed sort of upper left, lower left, upper right, lower right.
And the idea was that the entirety of a small choir could gather around this one book.
Exactly.
So when we're saying big, like how big? When you sit in front of one of these in a library, like how big is it?
If I am going to look at, say, 5 at a time, the librarian would want me to take a trolley. So I guess, well, they vary, and we know that, format isn't size. Generally, these are folios. Generally, they're probably from the tips of my fingers down to my elbow, and bigger.
Right.
Certainly, because you need, 8 to 12 singers to be able to see. In not very good light, and you need to you don't want to have too many page turns, because that starts to get disruptive and noisy, and you want to be able to print the musical notation with these little square or rhombus shaped note heads big enough so that people standing in, say, the 3rd row of boys can actually read the right note and sing the right note.
So what do you sort of look for in these books then? What are you looking for?
We are on the hunt for any mark that is not printed. So I guess the kind of holy grail for us is manuscript annotation, be that of the text, of the page in general, or specifically of the musical notation. So one thing, to give you an example, we've just done this spring we did our first big research trip as a team to Paris, which was fantastic. 4 days of
Those are the best places to go to.
One of the best places to go, especially in the spring. And there we were, and we had, between the 3 of us, a list of about 150 books that we got through over the 3 or 4 days that we were there. My heroic colleague Louisa went off to a couple of other smaller repositories as well. So what we were looking for we had our eyes peeled really for brown ink, that kind of, those of us who've seen annotations in 16th century books, there's a particular hue of brown or black ink that of this spidery writing.
It's different from the printed ink. Yeah,
exactly. And it can, lots of these repositories have outstanding digitization projects, which is completely amazing. It can be quite hard, especially if something's not printed, not digitized in color. It can be quite hard to say, oh, is this manuscript or print, particularly if you're not talking about a word. So if you've got a note head, so musical notation showing you the pitch and the rhythm of the particular note.
It's amazing how much historical research is done on the internet these days.
Absolutely.
Manuscripts and early books have been photographed, and digital photographs up on the web, but sometimes you need to see the real thing.
You need the real thing. And absolutely, I mean, we are so grateful for these amazing digitization projects, because they do enable a lot of the stuff, but there are aspects of our work that we simply cannot do without access to the actual physical object.
And what sort of things can they tell you, these, when you find the stuff that's not printed, the brown ink? What can it tell us?
One thing that happens quite a lot, that my colleague Elizabeth explained to me when I joined the project, is you often get little numbers above each of the notes, or above or below each of the notes. And what she realized, looking at it, is that those numbers corresponded to the note length, right? So the number of beats in a note. So if you've got a particularly tricky, complex section to play or sing, and you need the beats sort of written out for you, just as an aid to performance, really, or perhaps pedagogically as a way of understanding how that music rhythmically has been put together. Music is kind of art and maths all combined, isn't it? So
it's telling you something about the process of learning the music.
Exactly. It actually tells us about music literacy. It tells us about how people learned to read and write music in this period. What kinds of music were they learning from? What kinds of techniques, mnemonic techniques or pedagogical techniques were they learning to be able to interpret these signs and then use them themselves to communicate something? So you might also get words being changed. So very often, if music is printed, and it could be played by an instrument or sung by the human voice, and you will then have words that go with it a lot of the time. Now, nowadays, when someone is editing some music for publication, they pay a lot of attention to the positioning of the syllable that goes with each individual note, so that the person performing it can see really clearly what syllable goes with what note. With the techniques of printing we were talking about earlier, they've already got far too much to be doing, right, to be able to do this. So very often you get, the text is kind of dotted along the line. But you're not going to get a lot more than that. You have to work out for yourself. Now, sometimes with mass books, for example, lots of settings of the Latin Mass, these are the Kyrie eleison, the Gloria, the Sanctus, the Benedictus, the Agnus Dei. These movements, you are expected to be very familiar with these words. So they will you might get a Kyrie at the beginning, and you might get an eleison somewhere else, but you're not going to get the whole underlay, right? This word that we use to describe the text underneath the music. It kind of does what it says on the tin. So you will get people often writing in the syllables and the words that they're expected to sing. And sometimes they're actually changing those words. So one thing that happens is you have mentions of Mary being changed to Christ, or to the church, or as happened with liturgical books in England in the early to middle decades of the 16th century. You have mentions of the Pope and Thomas Becket being removed. So here you have an interpretation to make, right, as to why has this word been changed. When you've got a book of lots of different mass publications, are there annotations on every single mass, or are there just annotations on one or two? And that might say, oh, these are the masses that are particularly, the favored ones in that church
that are used.
So we can start to try to make educated guesses relating the broader religious, political, cultural context to the printed music, and then to try to not so much reconstruct, but analyze and explore the possible settings in which this music was heard, and how it was being used, and for what purposes, and what people thought about it.
Because of course, in the mid-16th century, like, music becomes controversial. It becomes part of the controversy of the Protestant Reformation, and that's why you get, in England, the word comes from on high. There must be no more references to the Pope. There must be, and of course they intensely dislike Thomas Becket because he's seen medieval saint, seen as a as a martyr for the independence of the church from the crown, which is obviously not Henry VIII's favorite thing, because he's trying to assert the control of the crown over the church. Right. So you get people ordered to do things like remove mentions of the Pope and St. Thomas Becket from all their books.
Exactly.
And yet at the same time, you don't see people ditching entire books.
No. Even when they're told to ditch or destroy entire books, you suddenly find that they've survived 500 years later in surprisingly large quantities. And I think there's a lot of luck in what happens to survive. There's a maxim in sort of provenance research, and I'll see if I can remember it the right way round, which is that large books linger longer, little books last least, or something words to that
Yes.
effect.
Yes.
Actually, printed books, particularly when they're bound in some kind of animal skin, are really quite hard wearing.
Yes.
Even the buildings around them might not survive as well as the books themselves. And if the book is bigger and heavier and thicker, that there's this idea that, and it kind of makes practical sense, right? That it's going to last longer. So that is something that also affects, in with music books or books containing music, as with any other genre of printed text.
We're only working with what happens to survive. We can never know what. There you are. So what actually counts as a music book?
Well, this is a question that Elizabeth, who's the PI of the project, who sort of contrived this whole endeavor that we're spending 5 years doing, actually took quite an open-minded definition of this, which is something of a departure from other studies. So we're considering books containing music rather than specifically music books. So the part books and the choir books that I talked about before, they are sort of uncontroversially going to be included as music books in anything, any kind of research into music books. The other kinds of books you get are tablature books. So stringed instruments like guitars and lutes have a completely different style of notation. I have no clue how to read it. Organ tablature as well. So we are including those. And then even further away from what you might typically consider to be a music book is a play, so a piece of drama that might have 1 or 2 choruses printed in it, and those choruses actually are polyphonic, right? They have harmonies, they have multiple pitches occurring at the same time, and that requires the printing of musical notation as well as text. So we find these texts that would not be in the music section of a library, and yet they contain musical notation.
Which is really interesting, just to think about, like the spread of polyphony and the different ways that people might actually have been using it, like in plays.
Absolutely. And the different sound worlds, the different settings in which you might encounter music, and how actually the same printed text, musical text, musical notation, might actually occur in really quite a wide range of settings. A motet by Josquin might be heard in a royal court or an ambassadorial court, in a church service in a Catholic country, or in a house in Staffordshire. Some random part of rural France. These books really, they travel.
And that's part, of course, of what printing does for the spread of music. So what's like your worst research experience? What's like the least rewarding research experience when you're trying to track down these sound worlds?
So occasionally in an archive, and this happened to us in Paris actually, you have a copy of an edition that's actually quite rare. It's an edition whereby, this may even be the only extant copy. And you get in there and it's in this 19th century binding, and that's not to disparage 19th century bindings. I've encountered a lot of them.
The binding's about 300 years later than the book.
Yeah, exactly. It's also a binding that occurs a lot. It's not particularly interesting or unique, unless you're interested specifically in 19th century bindings. And you open this book on its bookrest using proper archival practice to make sure we don't damage it. And you find that, the spine is actually quite tight.
Yeah, so you could barely open the pages.
Yeah, the pages are completely clean. And it's almost like, has anyone ever actually opened this piece? Have these pages been turned? And the spine is often tight because of the way it's been rebound, right? But and as we've said, this is perhaps a 19th century binding, but you really get no sense from the paper that this book has been held open in order to be sung or played from. And you think, this is like a unique copy of this edition. And I don't know that it's done anything other than sit on smart elite bookshelf to smart elite bookshelf, across two different countries.
But you can't even know that because it's telling you nothing.
Exactly. Yeah. It was a layer of interpretation that might be. Yeah.
It's always funny though, isn't it? The way librarians get so annoyed if you or I make marks in a book.
Yeah, it's really frowned upon. Yeah, you're really not supposed to do it.
But when it's somebody in the 1500s, we
all jump up and down and get super excited about it. Right. Yeah. Although I suppose fashions have changed, haven't they? So it used to be the case that these annotated books with contemporary annotations, right? Annotations from around the time they were printed and disseminated. It used to be the case that collectors and libraries didn't want them because they weren't quote unquote clean copies.
Really?
And so they wouldn't acquire them.
Wow.
Now, of course, fashions have changed, and we're all really, really interested in marginalia, and we get very excited about it. And I think that's the right side of things.
You can learn more from a book with marginalia than without.
I think that's a really good and diplomatic way of putting it. Yeah, there's a lot more we can add to the great tapestry of human knowledge, isn't there, from something that's got something added to it beyond what was printed.
Yeah. And so like what's been a good research experience? Like something that happened in a library with a book that actually made you smile, made you feel like you were really getting somewhere.
Yeah,
made you sort of feel like we've got some connection to the story of this book.
Well, there's a general thrill, right, that comes from just opening these books and handling them, that we that have survived for so long and that were handled by people so long ago, and they are sort of beautiful and moving and exciting in and of themselves. However, when you really start to get excited is I think I'm particularly drawn to anything with a name. So if I see someone's name in a book, then I start to get really excited, and I then have this immediate impulse to find out
who they were.
Who is this person? What were they like? Do they have other music books? Do they have other books? Are they only interested in this kind of music? And of course, more often than not, that is the one, particularly if it's an early name, that's the one book we have. And it's very often the case that this person has left no other documentary record that we can find. And I suppose the tricky thing is when you've got a limited number of days, say in Paris, we were there for 3 to 4 days, and you've got a certain number of books to get through and marks to record systematically so that you can create something that's reliable and sound for other scholars. You can't really be there going down the rabbit holes, which is always my instinct. So I have to kind of put asterisks and exclamation marks in the margins of my own notes and my own personal meta marginalia to come back to it and take lots of photographs. The other one was I have been working, so aside from consulting as many of these 1800 surviving copies as we can, we're also producing our own research articles around the broader themes of the project. And one thing that I've been working on is on pre-Reformation liturgical books and what happened to them in the later 16th century, what kinds of people owned them, because these were books that were supposed to be burned.
So these are Catholic pre-Reformation liturgical books, and who, after the great turning point of the Protestant Reformation, these are now contraband.
Absolutely, yes. So orders are put out successively to destroy, put away, render profane these in many ways sacred texts, right? So I've been looking particularly at missals, and these are books that really shouldn't have survived, right? They were supposed to be burned, but of these books, you have this real range of responses. You might imagine that these were books that were squirreled away by Catholics who were devoted to the old faith and who were either expecting for a reconversion of England to the Catholic faith, or who felt that it was their religious duty to preserve and protect these books that were instrumental to the performance of this really central rite to the practice of their religion. And you might imagine, therefore, that these books any annotations in them are either by priests, marking particular prayers or particular movements in the Mass, that they would at least be appropriate responses. And largely that is the case. It was not so with one missal I encountered in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, which is not somewhere you think of as having naughty books. And this is not a naughty book. This is a Hereford use missal. So as missals go, even rarer than what is already quite a rare book. Printed at Rouen in France in 1502. And someone in the calendar of the Mass, so this is a section right at the beginning of the book where they list all of the different feasts and saints' days. Someone has taken pains to conceal what is a wildly inappropriate message, so that
have they concealed it?
They've concealed it by writing it backwards and upside down.
Okay.
Which isn't it's not a hugely effective way of doing it. No. But what it says is, Anne Skinner is a slut by my say, which was not something I ever expected to encounter in a missal. And I really want to know who Anne Skinner is and
why? Yes.
What she could possibly have done to have her virtue so dismissed and undermined in this way, and who it was who had access to this missal and felt the need to record
disapproval of Anne Skinner's morals.
Absolutely.
In the missal.
Yeah, so I'd love to know what happened there, whether this was a courtship that went awry, or who knows.
And why in the missal? I mean, why in the contraband missal?
Absolutely, yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
I wonder what the priest thought.
Yes, when he opened the missal next time. Yeah. Yeah. So the marginalia are not always content appropriate or predictable.
Absolutely, because of course to us these are deeply precious, serious, exciting, scholarly books, and to people in the 16th century they were everyday books. And yes, paper was expensive, and yes, you would be told off for misusing the margins, particularly as this person misused the margins, particularly in this sort of book. But yeah, you kind of took it for granted. It wasn't special or rare necessarily to you. So I guess sometimes we might look at it almost fetishistically, like that we might imagine everyone was deeply pious and took the books really, really seriously, and a lot of the time there were fun and games and slander and libel and gossip and all kinds of unserious inappropriate things.
In a way these are living books. These were living books, and
absolutely
all kinds of bits of life get into them. And as you said, absolutely, of course, you do find plenty of pious annotations in holy books,
for
but
sure.
You also find the odd bit of scandalous gossip.
You do, and it's always a surprise and it's always a joy.
So I suppose it's a really interesting thread in that whole story of printing, in the way that music is changing. The music that people can hear is is changing, and inscribed in those printed books we can find little bits of people's lives and people's thoughts, and how the world sounded to them.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much. It's been great. Thanks.
It's been great fun. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Dust, Documents and Diamonds. If you've enjoyed it, please leave a review and share the link. You can also find @DustDocsDiamond on x.com and post your questions and comments.